It's full of stars.
So it's another week, another movie. This one was slightly delayed because I had to re-edit the video because of a copyright claim. But when I come up with the idea of covering a movie every week, I thought, what's a sort of good angle to do? And originally it was all about sequels, because when you think about it, we live in a world of sequels these days, and how often does a sequel come along years after the original that's not only as good, but maybe a better sequel? And yeah, Beetlejuice 2 got me thinking about this, but before the MCU and all that stuff, you forget that sequel was sort of a dirty word. You didn't really know what you were getting, and sequel for a lot of the audience out there meant it's just less than, but still the original. We've had films like Aliens, Godfather 2 and The Dark Knight, all of which are widely considered to be superior than the originals, which is hard because sequels are notoriously tricky in Hollywood, at least. For every good one, there's 5 bad ones, and of course, I'm probably referring just to the Fast and the Furious franchise on the back of that. And the problem is, to do it right, you need some ingredients that the first film has, but then you need to add more of it, making it better, and also try some new stuff as well. Think The Empire Strikes Back, pushing the stories and the characters in an arc that's enjoyable, but also one that makes sense and develops them as well. So, if you haven't guessed, in this video I am going to be talking about a sequel to one of the most famous, well-regarded pieces of cinema that's ever been made, and it's a sequel that not a lot of people know that exist. So let's get to it. As always, I'm Al, this is the Geek in Review. Thanks for taking the time to choose to watch the channel. If you haven't done it already, make sure you hit the subscribe button and leave a like if you make it all the way to the end of the video as well. So how do you follow up not only a sci-fi genre-defining film, but a film that's considered a classic of cinema, production, editing, direction, probably because it was made by someone that was a bit of a perfectionist? I'm talking about the movie 2010, The Year We Make Contact, which is a sequel to the Stanley Kubrick masterpiece 2001, which I'm willing to bet, as I said, most of you didn't even know existed, let alone had seen. Now, I can't go talking about the sequel without mentioning the original, so let's talk about the first one a bit. The only sci-fi film that Stanley Kubrick ever made, he was of course planning to direct AI before he passed away, and that fell to Steven Spielberg. But if you haven't seen the film, you're at least aware of the references in culture, like the iconic ape scenes with a monolith at the start, and the mind-bending finale, which is as stunning as it is confusing. 2001 and 2010 are based on novels from sci-fi legend Arthur C Clarke, charting humanity's history, discovering the monolith at the turn of the 21st century, and going well beyond that into the far-flung future. Now, I'm not going to get into the books too much in this video, but if you'd like to see a video about the trilogy of 2001 and the Arthur C Clarke series, let me know in the comments below. Of course, it's a Stanley Kubrick film, so that's why it looks so good, and that's why people consider it to be one of the best films ever made. The numerous slow space shots and the mind-bending effects, all of which make this the classic that it is, and I'm not even going to get into the music or the score. It's still considered to be a film that made such an impact that it's felt today in pretty much a wide range of modern movies, space and otherwise. And 2001 has such a grand scale to it on its own, even without the ideas that the film is trying to explore. So how do you follow that up, I guess? Well, a film that inspired so many and changed so much, told a unique story and looked so good as well, you'd normally go in the totally opposite direction, which is what Peter Hyam, the director of this film, pretty much kind of did. Making it real and gritty, a bit more feeling like the Alien or Aliens vibe, keeping it anchored with a real world conflict between the USSR and the USA. And remember, this film was made at the height and near the end of the Cold War between America and Russia. So 2010 really is a movie of its time. So given that it was made in the 80s, although it's set in the future, it's definitely a film of its time. So let's get into the movie background. On a budget of 28 million, and as I said, directed by Peter Hyams, who also directed the great space thriller Outlander with Sean Connery. I'd really recommend checking out that film if you haven't seen it as well. But 2010, the year we make contact, couldn't be any more different to the original. Shot mostly on LA sets, this was shot in about 70 days, so a modest film on a modest budget, at least by today's standards. And not to say that this film isn't ambitious, it certainly is, especially with its concept, but its execution is a little different to what we see in the world of 2001. Pretty much most of the films that he worked on, Stanley Kubrick destroyed the sets of 2001, meaning that they didn't have the insides and interiors of Discovery ship, so that had to be rebuilt. But the Discovery isn't the only ship in the film, there's also the Russian ship, the Leonov, where most of the movie is set, and the fact that this is set on a Russian spaceship with some American astronauts on it does add to that tension as well, because none of these people can go home. In fact, they're the furthest people from home and the furthest people that have ever been from home, and they're still carrying that political weight that exists back on Earth all the way out there. In terms of the style, the Leonov is totally different from Discovery, being a little bit more practical and a little less sci-fi future. Of course, we get Discovery and Hal back, and I'll get to that later on in the video. But if you're asking me, while it's not the sexiest ship that's ever been made, the Discovery is a sci-fi classic, as is the interior, especially the bridge and the docking bay set. But I do like that the Leonov has more sort of flashing buttons and dials, and like I say, it feels a lot more like a real spaceship. Also, if you notice, there's no AI on board the Leonov as well, and yet I'm going to get to Hal, don't worry about that. Picking up 9 years after 2001, obviously it's called 2010. While mankind hasn't made it all the way back out to Jupiter in the last decade, they have been keeping an eye on what's been going on. Planning another mission to go all the way out there to Jupiter and find out exactly what happened to Dave Bowman and the crew, they aren't ready to launch yet. The Russians let the Americans know, and being in a position to launch a ship first, they invite some Americans on board to go to Jupiter and maybe solve the mystery of what happened to the crew of the Discovery and get on board and speak to Hal. And this is where we meet and get introduced to the main cast of characters. As I said, we've got Roy Schneider as Dr. Floyd, Helen Mirren as Captain Kubrick, Dr. Chanra, who's Hal's creator, played by Bob Ballard, and the always reliable John Lithgow as a designer of the Discovery. On board the Russian ship Leonov, Dr. Floyd is awakened early and brought up to speed about rising tensions between the powers back home nearing war. As they get closer to Jupiter, the crew of the Leonov detect chlorophyll on one of the moons, Europa. Now, if you don't know anything about science, I'm not going to get too much into it, but chlorophyll is one of those things that you would expect to find on a planet with life, say like the planet that you're on at the moment. The crew of the Leonov send a probe to investigate, which is destroyed by some sort of energy beam coming from the surface before it gets too close, and Dr. Floyd, of course, thinks that it's a warning. They find the Discovery in a decaying orbit, and there's a great scene of them going between the two ships of the Leonov and the Discovery, and while this does pale a little bit to modern special effects, remember, this is the 80s and it looks absolutely brilliant for the time, so let's get that out the way. Although the budget and the special effects constraints at the time do limit what they can pull off, this film has some amazing shots of the actors in space, and the ship models themselves are absolutely brilliant as well. Like I say, it's not as sexy or sleek as the first one, but that's kind of the point. Once they manage to get on board the Discovery, they reactivate Hal to find out what happened to the original crew 9 years ago. Remember, Dr. Chanra designed Hal so he doesn't seem to buy the reasons given for what happened in 2001, with Hal causing the deaths of the crew, and ultimately being blamed in public. After making Discovery habitable, Dr. Floyd tells Kurnow he's planted a device on board the ship to disable Hal if he gets out of hand and malfunctions again. While this is going on, Dr. Chandra works with Hal and determines the reasons that he malfunctioned in 2001 is that he was given conflicting orders resulting in a moral conflict, and him being a machine, he didn't know what to do. The Russians aren't really interested in the mystery of what happened to the American ship 10 years ago, and are more interested in these strange readings they're getting in and around the moons of Jupiter. They send one of the Russian astronauts to investigate a new monolith that's been found around Jupiter, and before he gets too close to it, he gets sent off in a ball of light just like the probe. But I mean, what would you expect from these things? Maybe don't fuck around with a giant rectangle in space. Now, while this is all going on, Dave Bowman, the Lost Discovery astronaut from 2001, who became the Star Child at the end of the first movie, appears to Floyd, warning them that they have to leave the area. And this is the original Dave Bowman, played by Keir Dalia. And he is the only actor that's really back for this, apart from Douglas Rain, who of course reprises his role as the iconic voice of Hal. All this is going on out in space, it is set to the backdrop of the problems back on Earth, and the situation has got so bad it escalates, resulting in the Americans having to leave the Leonov to the Discovery, and Floyd having to convince Kubrick that they need to work together to leave before whatever happens is going to happen. They need both ships to leave, but the plan will result in Discovery being left behind after its engines are used to break orbit, and then they just let the Leonov carry them home. As they put the plan in motion to flee the area, Hal detects objects on the moon's surface of Europa, and it's thousands of monoliths that are slowly enveloping the planet. As they escape, leaving Hal and Discovery behind, there's a blinding flash of light from the moon, and Dave Bowman tells Hal to send a message to Earth, warning them not to land on the newly formed planet with a monolith awaiting new life to start again here, exactly as we've seen all the way back in 2001. Now, that's not everything that's in the movie, but it is pretty much the gist of it. And it's an odd sequel to a cinematic classic. But I guess the question that you have to ask yourself is, does it stand up? Does it meet the criteria for being a good or a better sequel? And if you ask me, yes, for what it's worth. I know it's a completely individual thing because people absolutely love and worship the first film, but just existing as a sequel, this one works on its own. The film builds on the first story and the world that it's set up. And while it looks different and even feels different, the core story of the Star Child, the monolith, and what its purpose was, and what it was all building up, and what it carried over from the original, make it a movie that does stand up, at least at the time. Especially all the miniature stuff in space, which for a space movie is pretty important. Now, here's a little factoid for you. Although you might not have seen 2010, you probably have seen the TV show or heard of it, Babylon 5. And the design for the Leonov was actually used in Babylon 5 with, I think it was the Omega class Earth destroyers. And if you put them side by side, it's pretty clear as they've got those big, huge rotational sections to help create gravity. Which makes it easier to hold down the like and subscribe button on this video. Like that this film is capturing, humanity that is just out there sort of wandering in the dark with no idea what's going on. And the film does answer your questions without overdoing it or getting bogged down in exposition. Because although when you do think about it, the galaxy is monumentally huge to a point that none of us can really understand or comprehend, but it's the fact that these people are so far away from home, but in a sort of universal or galactic sense, all this is happening in Earth's back door. And someone creating a new star and a new planet is absolutely mind-blowing, and it does raise a lot of questions about our own existence on this planet as well. The film, of course, isn't as grand in scope of terms of production of the first, and it is, as I said, very 80s and of its time, and that either works for you or it doesn't. But all the performances here are good. It's just a shame that the movie doesn't really stand out or is really memorable, because the first one totally does that. It defined or redefined what a great sci-fi movie is, was, and could be. Not to say that 2010 is a bad movie, I really enjoyed it. It just came out at a time when action movies were dominating the box office with muscle men, and if you weren't a Star Wars or a Star Trek fan, you didn't really stand a chance as a Hollywood movie getting made. There's a lot of sci-fi films from that era that don't stand up, and while this film isn't as well known as some of the others, or as well critically acclaimed as its original, it is still a cult classic and a great sequel if you ask me. I was a little bit too young the first time I seen this. I think I was about 11 or 12, and I was expecting, a pew-pew sci-fi adventure film with aliens. This isn't that. And when I watched it when I was younger, I realised that whatever was going on in this film, I couldn't get my head round the concepts, or at least it wasn't designed for an 11 or 12-year-old's brain. But rewatching this as an adult, it does annoy me a little bit that this film doesn't get more attention and isn't really as mentioned as often as it should be. But if you didn't like 2001, this film might be more for you, because I say it's less artsy farty and less of those long, sort of drawn out dramatic space shots with the sort of big booming operatic music. And it's much more of a grounded film, although it's set in space. I really love the idea that this film has of mankind having absolutely no idea of what's going on and just having to sit back and watch, because I think, and at least I hope, that if we do ever make it out into the stars and we do discover something, I'm not saying alien life, just something out there, it's going to be so mind-bending that it's going to take us completely, generations and generations just to get our head round what happened, let alone understand exactly what's been played out. Because this film has an odd ending for a sci-fi one, certainly an 80s sci-fi film, and it has a very sort of hopeful for the future. We know that someone is out there in the galaxy creating life, or at least manipulating it, but we don't exactly know what the end game is at this point. I think for me, the thing that really stands out for 2010, the year we make contact, and it's a complaint about a lot of Hollywood at the moment, or certainly the last 5 or 10 years, is films like this don't get made anymore. Low budget or mid budget sci fi films were always a hard one to pull off, but we did end up with countless classics over the years. Now we just seem to get sort of very cheap, shoddy, straight to DVD or straight to streaming ones, and there isn't really the thought or the demand for sci fi outside of the comic book franchises that we have at the moment. Which does make me sad, because I do think films like this, The Thing, Aliens are the ones that do make and do sort of push cinema forward. Not everything has to be a monumental blockbuster that's going to change cinema and be a classic, like a Marvel film or like 2001. And it is a miracle when you think about it today that this film got made so long after the original as well. While films on franchises like Beetlejuice and Ghostbusters are always going to be around and making a comeback, it seems that the sort of spirit or shadow of Kubrick hangs over the 2001 and the Arthur C Clarke universe. I'd love to see the series of novels get the same sort of treatment as Foundation and get adapted to the screen, but again, how are you going to sort of retell the tale of 2001 and make it different without it getting compared to what Kubrick done all those years ago? So, as you can tell, I really like this film, and if you're asking me, I think you should give it a watch. I'm not sure where it's available, but in the UK you can buy it from Amazon Prime and Apple TV. But if you get the chance to watch this, sit down. The first sort of 5 or 10 minutes are a little bit dull, and it's one of the films that you don't really need to watch the original to pick up what's going on. It leads you through it step by step, all the way from Jupiter to Earth and back. And the questions that it leaves doesn't set up a sequel, it just sets up the potential future of mankind. But I want to know what you guys think. Have you seen 2010, the year we make contact? Have you seen it recently? Probably not. Let me know in the comments below if you have seen the film and what you thought. So I hope you enjoyed the show, and I hope you'll join me for that. And as always, my name's Al. Thanks for watching.